Um terremoto político sacudiu a Rússia 100 anos atrás, com repercussões que abalam o mundo até hoje. Nasceu então, 1917, a primeira experiência prática de um governo voltado para eliminar a propriedade privada e aplicar o comunismo, elaborado em teoria pelos alemães Karl Marx e Friedrich Engels. Para bem ou mal, foi um tempo que ajudou a mudar o tempo que viria depois. A ascensão e a queda do comunismo tem sido tema de pesquisa e ensino do professor de história Archie Brown, da Universidade de Oxford, na Inglaterra, há quase meio século. Dá título a seu volumoso livro sobre o assunto, lançado também no Brasil. O milênio encontrou o professor Brown em sua casa de Oxford, onde um raro dia de sol e calor para os padrões britânicos nos levou a conversar no jardim, enfeitado de cerejeiras e magnólias.
A momentous year in Russia, 1917. The Tsar is deposed at the beginning of the year, and the year ends with the Bolsheviks taking power with Lenin. Some historians say one coup and one revolution. What is your opinion? Which was which?
Well, I'd be more inclined to say that the earlier one, the one that took place in March, which the Russians called the February Revolution because their calendar was different at that time, I'd be more inclined to say that was a revolution, more spontaneous. And the Bolshevik one was a bit closer to a coup, but these terms really depend on whether you basically approve or basically disapprove of what happened. I mean, it's a fine line between a coup and a revolution often, but it's very seldom that a revolution has most of the people in the country participating. It usually depends very much on a capital city. And there were a lot of Petrograd workers, and of course St. Petersburg was called Petrograd at that time, who did support what the Bolsheviks called their revolution, their October Revolution.
No início de 1917, a monarquia liderada pela dinastia Romanov foi derrubada por um grupo reformista que implantou um governo provisório liberal comandado por Alexander Kerensky. Meses depois, o russo Vladimir Lenin, recém-retornado de longo exílio, apoiou-se na facção partidária chamada de bolchevique e nos comitês populares chamados de sovietes. Depois, o governo provisório tomou o poder e assumiu o comando político da Rússia, para formar então a União Soviética.
Do you think that the main mistake by the provisional government that deposed the Tsar and stayed in power for a few months only, do you think their main error was to have remained in the First World War? In other words, continued the fighting that was provoking so much pain to Russia?
Continuing the war certainly undermined the provisional government fundamentally because there was immense war weariness in Russia. Lenin referred to the soldiers as peasants in uniform, and they were absolutely fed up with the war, and so the Bolsheviks gained a lot of traction through their opposition to the war.
Do you think that the revolution in 1917 already carried the seeds of the explosion of communism? In other words, the mistakes, the failure was already there?
Well, I think the failure of communism was there from the start, in the sense that communism didn't have any part for legitimate opposition to government. The authoritarian nature of communism was there from the beginning. There was this absolute belief that history was on their side. Things like democratic centralism, which meant, hierarchical communist party with strict discipline and very limited rights of dissent, even within the party. All these things, I think, made it fairly clear that this would be a highly authoritarian regime, though it did help the regime to survive for a long time.
Do you think that after all that we have found out about Lenin, can we still hold the thought that he would have gone a different way, that he was a different kind of political leader?
Lenin, I think, would have been different from Stalin in the sense that he would not have used terror against members of the party in the way Stalin did. I mean, Stalin killed many of his own comrades, but Lenin didn't hesitate for a moment in using terror against people who were opposed to the Bolsheviks, including against Social Democrats, any kind of liberals. So Lenin, I would say, was utterly ruthless and authoritarian in nature, and his ideology was also authoritarian. But, you know, he was not fundamentally quite as bad as Stalin. How the system would have worked out, I don't know, but it would still have been authoritarian under Lenin, no question.
What made communism such an attraction?
Communism was seen as a way of getting an underdeveloped country economically developed quite quickly, and that seemed to be something that the Soviet Union was doing under Stalin. For many communists, especially in Asia, it was linked up with national liberation. And it's not accidental, I think, that of the 5 communist states that survive today, 4 of them are in Asia, and the 5th one, Cuba, it's also a case where communism and national independence went together.
People inside communist countries, and many of them, had no choice about the regime that was in power. They had to conform to the regime. But dedication to communism remained strong in the West, in countries that were not communist. And in countries, people actually did receive information about what was happening in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, but chose not to believe it, chose to continue supporting and not accepting the bad news and being sympathizers with the system, no matter what. What led to that blindness?
It's difficult to explain. I mean, even the American ambassador to Moscow at the time of the show trials believed these stories that were being told in court about how all these Red Army generals had been conspiring against the Soviet Union and so on, which are obviously untrue. So even people who weren't even left-wing often believed those stories. And on the left, there was a tendency, part of the left, you know, because of their anti-capitalism, to believe that things must be so much better in the Soviet Union. And if they weren't as good as they should be, that was because of the backwardness of Russia. And so communism in the West would be much more successful. So it was a terrible illusion. But at the same time, it should be remembered there were a great many social democrats who were not taken in and who remained firmly anti-communist.
What about the people inside the communist countries? You know, very clearly that they could see there was a privileged elite. There was a so-called nomenclatura that benefited from all the good side they could find out in the system, whereas the rest of the people didn't. But they had no choice. They had to conform to it.
Yes, it's true, but of course the regime did have some attractions as well. For Russians, Stalin and the regime were associated with victory in the war, and even today in post-Soviet Russia, Stalin's popularity is going up. Now that's partly because there is less emphasis now on the crimes of Stalin, much less emphasis than there should be, but it's also because people have nostalgia for that time, they think stable prices, they think order, some kind of order when people were being arrested in the middle of the night, but they think of it as order, and they still associate Stalin with the great victory in the Second World War.
You know, a theoretical exercise, if we could, if we get the great theorists of the system, you know, Marx and Engels, if we could imagine these two German intellectuals going to the Soviet Union, let's say in the 80s, in the 1980s, would they have been shocked? Would they have been surprised?
I think they would have been shocked, yes. When I was in Moscow in 1967, the 50th anniversary of the revolution, a balloon with Lenin's face appeared in the sky, and Lenin beaming down on this, my beloved creation. But I think if the real Lenin had come back and seen Brezhnev's Soviet Union, he'd have been fairly shocked.
It finally exploded in the late 1980s, beginning of the 90s. But it's still on in a few countries. We have not too many nowadays: North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, China even. Why do you think it stayed on in these places? Different reasons, or they all have one basic motivation?
I think they've got one thing in common, and well, maybe two things in common. One is that they associated it with national independence and getting rid of colonialism, and also there's a common anti-American element. And they all had reasons to be critical of the United States. After all, Vietnam, North Korea, and Laos were all at the receiving end of American bombs. And Cuba, of course, has been locked in conflict with the United States, you know, ever since the Castro Revolution. So those are very strong elements, and that's a big difference from Eastern Europe, because in Eastern Europe people associated national independence with throwing off communism, because for them it was part of a Soviet empire. But in Asia, and indeed in Cuba, national independence and communism are to a certain extent linked.
Are these countries that kept it, North Korea is a case apart, but the others, do you think they are going through a transition, including China, that makes it even rather odd to call them communist countries nowadays?
Yes, I mean, China, I would say, is still a communist country only in the political sense and not in the economic sense at all. In terms of leading role of the party, monopoly of power of the Communist Party, democratic centralism, it still has that. But half of the economy is in private hands, and it's no longer a command economy, it's essentially a market economy. 2/3 of industrial output is from the private sector, so this is no longer a communist economy. So China is really a hybrid.
And North Korea, of course, is such an odd case that we can't even try to make sense out of it.
North Korea is the one classic totalitarian communist state, because Vietnam and Laos are following more in the Chinese path, and even in Cuba now there are some tentative economic reforms.
I like an observation in your book. You talk about Laos, and you say that in Laos, religion is no longer the opium of the people, but opium is the opium of the people in Laos.
Yes. A BBC correspondent in Laos said that, and
that was a very, very good line.
Yeah.
Я могу сейчас вам сказать, что внутренне я готов, но...
Mikhail Gorbachev foi o último presidente da União Soviética. Ganhou fama mundial ao deslanchar reformas que abriram a sociedade e a política soviética, chamada Glasnost, e tentou reestruturar a economia ossificada do país, perestroika. Soviéticos e americanos, antes arqui-inimigos durante a Guerra Fria, se aproximaram no campo diplomático após décadas de hostilidade mútua. Gorbachev iniciou o processo que iria acabar com o domínio soviético sobre a Europa do Leste. Por ironia, jamais teve em seu próprio país o prestígio que conquistou no exterior. Em 1990, Gorbachev recebeu o Prêmio Nobel da Paz. Na noite de Natal, em 25 de dezembro de 1991, às vésperas de acabar a União Soviética, ele renunciou.
Gorbachev chose to emphasize reforms on a political level, leaving the economy aside, as thinking perhaps that if he reformed the political side, the economy would come next. that didn't seem to have worked. And then as he reformed the political side, he lost the monopoly of the communist power of the Communist Party, and therefore his power dwindled away.
In the Soviet Union, there were tremendous vested interests in the Communist Party, the ministries, the factory managers against economic reform. So it had been quite difficult. But Gorbachev came to value political reform for its own sake. And he himself was radicalized in the course of perestroika. He began as a communist reformer and finished as a social democrat.
This transition that he went through, do you think that the big change was actually seeing what was happening and realizing that there was no way that he could continue believing in the traditional principles, although he was the Secretary General of the Communist Party?
Yes, Gorbachev traveled a fair bit in the 1970s in Western Europe, in Germany and France and Italy, and that was the beginning of his realization that life under so-called bourgeois democracies was not the way it was portrayed in party literature, that people were living much better and more freely than he had appreciated. And this learning process went on. And when he was leader and meeting foreign leaders and engaging with them, he was influenced by that. In fact, the two foreign interlocutors he liked best and found himself most at home with were social democrats, Felipe González, the Spanish socialist prime minister, and Willy Brandt, the former chancellor of West Germany, who at that time was heading the Socialist International, the organization of social democratic socialist parties. So Gorbachev was somebody who had a relatively open mind, a remarkably open mind for a communist leader, and his evolution continued right throughout his general secretaryship.
And as part of his revolution, he made so many changes that, as expected, he touched on the interests of a lot of people, including the hardliners who were scandalized by what he was doing.
Poucas vezes é possível testemunhar um acontecimento e ter certeza de que a história, com H maiúsculo, está sendo escrita diante de seus próprios olhos. Este certamente é um desses momentos. Em ritmo de batucada, de alegria, na beira do Muro de Berlim, as pessoas estão aqui comemorando a abertura do Muro de Berlim. Há poucos dias, uma pessoa que tentasse atravessar do outro lado do muro, de Berlim Oriental para cá, poderia ser fuzilada pelos guardas de fronteira. Hoje, isso aqui parece uma rua de pedestres. As pessoas estão comemorando em ritmo de batucada e de samba. O Muro de Berlim em si ainda está aqui, mas em espírito ele já desapareceu.
We know, and you describe it well, that the system was pretty much rotten inside. But could he have lasted a bit longer? Not forever, but a bit longer. Under repression, perhaps.
I think the system certainly could have lasted longer. In this century, Putin has benefited from the rise in the oil price in Russia. It's not so good now, but one reason why he became much more popular than Yeltsin was that pensions were paid in time, wages were paid in time as the oil price increased. With the level of repression there was in the Soviet Union, the sanctions for oppositional behavior, the rewards for good behavior, the system could have gone on for a few more decades. Eventually it would have failed in one way or another, possibly more violently, but it certainly could have continued for longer. I mean, look at a country like North Korea today. It's an economic basket case, absolutely hopeless, and yet it survives on the basis of repression and strict control.
What about the opposite of that coin? Trying to see if he could have imploded earlier. After all, there were revolts in East Germany in 1953, there was Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, and then elections in Lech Wałęsa in Poland, 79, and it didn't happen.
Yes, I think in retrospect, and even at the time, it seemed to me that the Soviet Union made a big mistake in Czechoslovakia in intervening militarily there in August 1968, because this was a reform from inside the Communist Party, and it was actually quite popular, and there was a chance of a gradual democratization there, and it could have had a positive impact on the Soviet Union. But the Soviet leadership were so fearful of democratization in Czechoslovakia and fearful of that infection spreading that they cracked down on it. And so that put an end for a long time to the possibility of any serious political reform in communist systems.
How about the influence that people in the change that people like the Pope, Pope John Paul II had, Reagan, even Lech Wałęsa in Poland, the influence that these people had in eventually imploding the system?
Yeah, the Pope obviously was hugely influential in Poland, and the Solidarity took its sort of spiritual strength, from the election of a Polish Pope. And Lech Wałęsa was much admired, but the Polish example wasn't followed anywhere. And we should remember that even in Poland, the communist authorities, who were far weaker than the communist authorities in the Soviet Union, were able to impose their own martial law. They cracked down in December 1981. And when Solidarity re-emerged in Poland, 1988-89, this was thanks to the change in Moscow, much more than to the Pope.
The change and what we're calling the implosion happened. There was the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89, and then some other changes, and finally the disappearance of the Soviet Union in '91. In any case, it lasted for 70 years. Why did it last for so long? What was the attraction? What were the qualities or the conditions that made it last 70 years?
Well, I think it was a system of rewards and punishments, that if you were played by the rules of the game, in the post-Stalin period, you could live a quiet life. And, I used to go to Moscow, and people whom I met in research institutes, academics, on the whole, they weren't as well paid as people in the West, but they read a lot of books, they had a reasonably comfortable life. They had a peaceful life, which was perfectly tolerable. There were lots of restrictions. They couldn't go abroad freely. There were lots of frustrations. But of course, if you protested against this, you would lose what privileges you did have. So this system of rewards and sanctions, I think, worked very effectively over a long period.
Chega o fim de semana e lá vem eles outra vez. A turma do leste, da parte comunista da Alemanha. Aproveitam a recente abertura do Muro de Berlim para visitar o lado capitalista da cidade, ver amigos, parentes, fazer compras e voltar. Chegam em massa, entopem as lojas e transtornam os serviços da cidade. Mas são bem recebidos, como primos pobres de uma mesma família, dividida contra a vontade. As autoridades, pelo menos, não se queixam dos visitantes. Já perceberam que, em termos de disciplina, é difícil ganhar dos alemães orientais. Eles obedecem à polícia sem hesitar, esperam nas filas sem reclamar. São tão certinhos que as bibliotecas públicas vêm recebendo devolução de livros tomados emprestados há 28 anos. Desculpe a demora, explico, mas construíram um muro no caminho.